The Red Terror was the Bolsheviks' violent purge of anyone deemed a threat to their new communist order. This radical Marxist faction decided to destroy Russia and implement a slave regime. After overthrowing the provisional government in 1917 following the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II, Lenin and his party faced opposition. This sparked a civil war between the Reds, the Bolsheviks, and the Whites, a mix of monarchists, liberals, and anti-communist Christians, along with smaller factions like the Greens, mainly peasant rebels. To crush dissent, they unleashed the Cheka, their secret police, to carry out kidnappings, mass arrests, torture, and executions. Nobles, priests, intellectuals, anarchists, and ordinary civilians were targeted. Later, even workers who failed to meet quotas weren't safe. In this process, they also enslaved their own people and crushed Christian religion. Estimates of casualties range from 50 to 600,000 because the Bolsheviks enforced their brutal repression and ideological fanaticism. Lenin and his followers believed that a totalitarian crackdown was necessary to maintain their rule and prevent counter-revolution. The Red Terror campaign was ideological, aiming to eliminate all opposition and cement an oppressive communist state. Lenin's policies during this period set the stage for the brutal repression that would define Soviet rule for decades. The Holodomor, also known as the Ukrainian famine, was a mass famine in Soviet Ukraine that cost millions of lives. After Lenin's death, Stalin intensified Bolshevik terror, enforcing brutal collectivization. Private land was taken from everyone, and by early 1931, over 90% of Ukrainian farms were seized by the communist state. The Bolsheviks confiscated all food, grain, crops, livestock, even pickled goods, leaving peasants to starve. Resistance was met with execution or torture. Stalin used the famine as a weapon to crush Ukrainian independence movements, deliberately worsening conditions to punish the population for resisting Soviet policies. The dekulakization campaign was part of this, leading to the destruction of the peasant class. So-called kulaks, peasants with more than 3 hectares of land, and their families were arrested, deported, and executed. Estimates placed the death toll between 7 and 10 million. Recognized by dozens of countries as a genocide, the Holodomor remains one of history's most horrific examples of starvation as a tool of political repression. The Great Purge was Stalin's campaign to consolidate absolute power by eliminating opposition within the Communist Party, military, and wider society. Carried out by the NKVD, the secret police of the USSR, under chiefs Genrik Yagoda and later Nikolai Yesov. In 1936, the purges began with the removal of high-ranking officials, old Bolsheviks, regional bosses, and military commanders, before expanding to mass executions on intellectuals, professionals, and ethnic minorities like Volga Germans and Soviet Poles. The Great Purge also included the Moscow show trials, where high-profile figures were coerced into confessing to fabricated crimes. The trials not only led to execution, but also instilled widespread fear and paranoia, effectively crushing dissent. Anyone suspected of disagreeing with the communist government was tortured, executed, or shoved into wooden cattle wagons and sent to death camps called gulag. In these brutal labor camps, including the infamous Nazino Island settlement, prisoners faced starvation, violence, disease, and even cannibalism. Those who attempted to leave were taken out by the guards. Forced labor projects like the White Sea-Baltic Canal claimed tens of thousands of lives. By 1938, the NKVD had executed an estimated 700,000 to 1.2 million people, with another 1.7 million perishing in the gulags. The Katyn Massacre was the Soviet NKVD's execution of nearly 22,000 Polish military officers, police, border guards, and intellectuals on Stalin's orders. Carried out in several locations, the massacre is most associated with Katyn Forest, where mass graves were discovered by German forces in 1943. Stalin's secret order targeted the Polish officer corps, with around 8,000 of the victims captured during the 1939 Soviet invasion of Poland, 6,000 being police officers and the rest consisting of intellectuals and civilians accused by the Soviets of being spies. The Cambodian Genocide was the systematic extermination of Cambodians by the Communist Party of Kampuchea, also known as the Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot. The Khmer Rouge were heavily supported by the Chinese Communist Party and its chairman, Mao Zedong, for many years. When the Khmer Rouge seized power in 1975, they aimed to transform Cambodia into a classless society, eradicating all aspects of culture. Pol Pot wanted to turn everyone into rural agricultural workers rather than educated city dwellers whom he believed to have been corrupted by capitalist ideas. Under Pol Pot's Year Zero ideology, they dismantled the cities, abolished money, private property and religion, and forced millions of urban residents into labor camps in the countryside. There, mass executions, forced labor, torture, malnutrition and disease were rampant. Victims were taken to the killing fields where they were often executed with pickaxes to conserve bullets. They took out anyone who wasn't sufficiently pure. They even targeted people who wore glasses because reading books was apparently too capitalist. Ethnic minorities like Cham Muslims and Vietnamese were specifically targeted. The Khmer Rouge's reign ended in 1979 after Vietnam invaded, but by then 2 million people had died. The Ethiopian Red Terror was a brutal purge by the communist Derg regime against rival Marxist-Leninist groups, particularly the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party. The Ethiopian Red Terror was part of the Derg's consolidation of power after overthrowing Emperor Haile Selassie, and though its peak was from 1977 to 78, the terror extended over a broader timeframe. Led by Chairman Mengistu Mariam, the campaign began with a speech in the heart of Addis Ababa declaring death to counter-revolutionaries, and quickly escalated into mass arrests, mass executions and street massacres. Civilians were armed and turned into informants, homes were raided and anyone suspected of dissent was often abducted and never seen again. Machine gun-mounted jeeps patrolled Addis Ababa, gunning down perceived enemies. The Derg regime also herded people into churches and burned them down. Women faced sexual violence and the sheer brutality led to an estimated death toll of up to 500,000, including many children. The Great Leap Forward was a campaign led by the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong. It was his ambitious but catastrophic attempt to turn China into an industrial powerhouse overnight. His plan forced millions into massive rural communes, where families were separated, private property was abolished, and every aspect of life was dictated by the Communist Party. Peasants were expected to farm and produce steel simultaneously, despite having no expertise. Grain quotas were based on wildly exaggerated numbers, leading officials to seize food that didn't exist, leaving millions to starve. Reporting the truth was dangerous as anyone questioning the policies risked public humiliation, torture, or execution during Mao's anti-right deviation struggle. The result was one of the deadliest famines in history, killing between 15 to 55 million people. Mao refused to take responsibility and blamed rightists, bad weather, or poor implementation. The chaos led to poorly built infrastructure, including dams that collapsed in 1975, claiming even more lives. The Cultural Revolution in China was Mao Zedong's chaotic attempt to wipe out opposition and reaffirm his grip on power after the disaster of the Great Leap Forward, framing it as a fight against hidden capitalists and traditional Chinese culture. He unleashed the Red Guards in 1966, radicalized student militias who terrorized China under the slogan to "Rebel is justified." During the Red August, these fanatics attacked teachers, intellectuals, and anyone suspected of being an enemy of the regime. A wave of mass killings in Beijing started with a death toll of up to 10,000. The Red Guards also waged war on the Four Olds: old ideas, culture, customs, and habits, ransacking homes, burning books, and destroying artifacts. Schools also shut down, and over 10 million urban youth were exiled to the countryside for re-education. The chaos spiraled in 1967 as radical factions turned on each other, government functions collapsed, and millions were either killed or persecuted. Widespread violence and mass killings occurred across the country, including massacres in Guangxi, Beijing, Inner Mongolia, Guangdong, Yunnan, and Hunan. Estimates of the death toll during the Cultural Revolution range from 1 to 2 million. Some even go higher when including all forms of death. The Hungarian Uprising Crackdown. The Hungarian Uprising was a brief but brutal reminder that the Soviet Union had no patience for rebellion. After Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev's policy of de-Stalinization gave Eastern Bloc countries a glimmer of hope for reform. That illusion shattered when Hungary tried to break free. The Hungarian people had suffered under the hardline communist rule of Matyas Rákosi, whose secret police arrested dissenters for something as small as listening to Western music. When protests erupted in 1956, Moscow swapped Rákosi for Ernő Gerő, but he was just as unpopular. Pressure mounted and a more liberal leader, Imre Nagy, took charge, promising reforms including leaving the Warsaw Pact. That was a step too far for Khrushchev. In November 1956, the Soviet Union sent in tanks and troops to crush the rebellion. Thousands of Hungarians were killed, hundreds of thousands more fled, Nagy was executed, and János Kadar was installed as Moscow's puppet. Hungary's dream of independence was violently extinguished. The Vietnamese land reform was launched by the Communist Party of Vietnam to redistribute land from landlords to peasants, aiming to eliminate class distinctions and boost agricultural productivity. After the 1954 Geneva Accords temporarily divided Vietnam, the North, under Ho Chi Minh's leadership, implemented this policy to consolidate communist control and build a socialist society. The reform involved identifying landlords or reactionaries, subjecting them to public trials, and often executing them, with estimates suggesting 3,000 to 15,000 were killed. Misclassifications also led to the persecution of many peasants. The campaign saw widespread imprisonment, deportation, and forced collectivization of goods and land, causing food shortages and social unrest. The Cuban post-revolution repression. The Cuban Revolution may have overthrown Batista's brutal dictatorship, but what followed wasn't exactly the freedom many had hoped for. After Fidel Castro's 26th of July movement seized power on New Year's Eve 1958, the new government wasted no time in consolidating its rule. Revolutionary tribunals sprang up, putting former Batista officials, suspected counter-revolutionaries, and anyone seen as a threat to the new order on trial. These trials were often quick and lacking due process, with many ending in torture or mass executions by firing squads. Estimates of those executed range from 1,000 to over 5,000. Initially, public support for these purges was high. Many of those killed were seen as symbols of Batista's tyranny. As time went on, it became clear that this wasn't just about justice, it was about control. The crackdown expanded, free speech and political opposition were suppressed, and Cuba steadily transformed into a one-party communist state. By 1965, the revolution had fully aligned itself with Marxism-Leninism, and repression became a permanent feature of the Communist Party of Cuba. The East German border killings. In 1961, the Berlin Wall was constructed to prevent people fleeing to the West. East Berlin was the capital of East Germany, which was under Soviet influence. West Berlin was a beacon of freedom and prosperity within the communist bloc. The flow of people, especially skilled workers and professionals, from East to West Berlin was seen as a critical threat to the East German economy and the legitimacy of the communist state. Soviet bloc propaganda described the Berlin Wall as a shield safeguarding its citizens against fascist forces plotting to undermine the people's desire to construct a communist state in East Germany. Between 1961 and 1989, the East German border guards under the SED government, influenced by Soviet policy, shot and killed hundreds attempting to escape to freedom. Estimates suggest around 327 people died, civilians, border guards, and even children, at or near the border through shootings, drowning, or triggering mines. The regime's tight control over information concealed these tragedies from public eye. The Soviet-Afghan War was a brutal intervention to support the communist Afghan government against Islamic anti-communist Mujahideen rebels. In 1979, Soviet troops rolled into Afghanistan under the pretense of helping a sister socialist nation to support the Afghan administration that had been installed during the Operation Storm 333. The Soviet military unleashed relentless carpet bombings, wiping out villages, cities, and key infrastructure. Some estimates say half of Afghanistan's villages were completely destroyed. Then came the mines, millions of them, some disguised as toys, leading to horrific civilian casualties, especially among children. Reports also detail massacres like the one in Logar province in 1982, as well as widespread sexual assault and torture by pro-Soviet forces, all designed to break the will of the population. The war created one of the largest refugee crises of the time, with millions of Afghans fleeing to Pakistan and Iran. By the time the Soviets withdrew in 1989, 1 to 3 million Afghans had died. The conflict is often called the Soviet Union's Vietnam. The Tiananmen Square massacre was the Chinese government's brutal response to weeks of student-led protests calling for political reform. It all started in April '89 after the death of Hu Yaobang, a pro-reform Communist Party leader. China was in the midst of rapid economic changes and people were frustrated. Some benefited from the new market economy while others suffered. Inflation, corruption, and job security were hot issues. So students, workers, and intellectuals rallied together, demanding democracy, freedom of speech, and government accountability. By May, protests had spread to over 400 cities and nearly 1 million people filled Tiananmen Square in Beijing. The government wavered between dialogue and crackdown before ultimately declaring martial law. On June the 3rd to 4th, troops and tanks stormed Beijing, crushing barricades and opening fire on unarmed demonstrators or bystanders. The exact death toll remains unknown, but estimates range from several hundred to several thousand. In the aftermath, the Chinese government cracked down on dissent nationwide, arresting protesters and censoring information. The North Korean prison camp system, known as Kwanli-so, often compared to concentration camps, has been a tool of the communist regime since the 1950s to suppress dissent and enforce ideological conformity. These camps are not just places for incarceration, but are designed for brutal punishment of political prisoners and their families. The system operates on a policy of multi-generational punishment, where children are imprisoned for the crimes of their parents or grandparents. Some crimes can be passed on to the next 3 generations. In these camps, inmates endure forced labor under extreme conditions with insufficient food, medical care, and subject to torture. Reports from defectors and satellite imagery have revealed conditions so harsh that many prisoners die from malnutrition, disease, or are executed. The exact number of prisoners and deaths remains a secret, but estimates suggest that tens of thousands are held in these camps at any given time.